You see, the most fundamental thing about the human nature that Genesis 3 is telling us here is that we were born with a deep sense of inadequacy that we're trying to cover up or uncover in other people to make us feel better about our own situation. The problem is fig leaves don't work, do they? And there lies the problem. They're always falling apart, and they're always drafty, man. I mean, this don't work. So what are we going to do about this? How are we going to cover ourselves up? How are we going to get back to the place that the garden echo reminds us exists and we were made for? Here's the good news. On a very dark night, there was a man who was turned out. There was a man who was left alone in utter darkness. There was a man who, in every sense of the word, came under the sword, came under the spear, took nails in his body, and received judgment from God. There was a man whose blood was shed at the east end of the garden under the sword of God's judgment. Do you see it? Look at verse 20 again. This is so fascinating to me. The man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all the living. Now, why would Adam rename Eve? If you know in the story, her name isn't Eve yet. Do you know what her name is? Woman. Now, I have two hypotheses for why Adam renamed her. One, I think he renamed her because if he didn't, men would be getting punched in the face all the time. Hey, woman. Right? So thank you, Adam, for changing the name there. My second hypothesis, and there might be some more credibility to this one, is that Adam's renaming of Eve is a statement of faith in the promise of God. Because Eve means mother of life. The curse was that they would die. The promise was that there would come one from the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head and kill death. So when Adam renames his wife Eve, it's as if he's saying, I believe in the promise of God. I, in faith, believe that some way, somehow, God's going to fix the mess that I've made. In naming the woman Eve, Adam is saying there's been a promise given in the midst of the curse of death that life will come forth. Therefore, I'm going to name my wife Eve because she's going to be the mother of all living things. Humanity will not be smote from the planet. God will be faithful. We will have children. Even in our sin, He's been merciful and gracious and not cutting us off from bearing like kind. And she will not only be the mother of all of the living in the human race, she will ultimately be the mother of the one being who was really born, the only being who was truly born, ultimately alive, and that had in him the capacity to bring about life for all the walking dead. Then an incredible display of God's grace. The very next verse after Adam's statement of faith in the promise of God comes the gracious provision of God in the clothing of them and the covering of their nakedness. You see, they grab fig leaves running by, thoughtlessly grabbing whatever they get their hands on to cover them up, and God very intentionally chose a different form of covering them, namely the killing of an animal, the shedding of blood, so that new skin could be made. And the picture here is of a tunic, it's of a robe. It's literally something that would cover them to their ankles, cover all of their body. And to the Israelite reading this, they would have picked very quickly up on what is happening here. Those robes, that tunic, that reminds us of the robes and the tunics that the priests are required to wear when they're serving in the temple, making sacrifices and atoning for the sins of the people and making a way for sinful man to access holy God. And for us on this side of the cross, we read this and we go, hey, wait a minute. That reminds me of someone else's blood who was shed. You see, the first way they tried to cover up was done by the hands of man. The second time they were covered up was done by the hands of God. The first time they tried to cover up, it was accomplished by the work of man. The second time they were covered was done by the work of God. Interesting to note, the first death experience in the garden after Adam and Eve sinned was death on their behalf to cover their sin and their shame. Done at the hands of God, shedding the blood of an animal that had not sinned, killing an animal who had done no wrong, to cover the nakedness and shame brought about by people who had actually sinned and done wrong.